Welcome to Dead Scary Stories. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, comment which story you thought was the scariest. Now lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. I don't even know why I invited him up. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the way his smile had seemed harmless earlier in the evening. Harmless. That was the word I'd used when I told myself it was fine to let him in. A harmless man in an olive green jumper who held doors open and asked questions like he cared about the answers. Just one drink and then he'd leave. But he didn't leave. He'd walked into my flat with the easy confidence of someone who'd been there before, even though I knew he hadn't. He placed his coat on the back of my sofa without waiting for me to offer, then took a seat, his body sinking into the cushions like they'd been waiting for him. I laughed nervously, said something about how cozy the place was, trying to fill the air between us. He didn't answer, just smiled faintly and watched me as I moved to the kitchen to fetch the bottle. When I came back, he was still sitting there, one leg crossed over the other, his hands resting on his knee. He looked like he'd settled in for the night. I handed him a glass, but his fingers didn't close around it straight away. They brushed mine, briefly, and stayed there just a beat longer than I wanted. I took the chair opposite him and tried to steer the conversation to a close. Little hints like, "It's getting late," and "You've got a long drive back, haven't you?" He didn't respond to either, just stared at me with this calm, steady look. He wasn't smiling anymore. It was when I stood up, pretending I needed to tidy away the bottle, that he said it. We belonged together, not out loud, not in words. It was in the way he stood too, unhurried but definite, stepping between me and the door. I told myself not to panic. Maybe he'd had too much to drink. Maybe he just needed me to be firm. I asked him to leave. I asked again. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't even look confused. When I tried to walk past him, his hand shot out, not to grab me, not yet, but to reach for the door. He turned the lock with a quiet click. The air felt sharper suddenly, like the temperature had dropped. He moved to the side of the door, leaning against it, his arms folded. His smile was back, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. I tried to think of what to do next, how to get him out without making it worse. My phone was in my bag, but the bag was on the table by the sofa, too far to reach without brushing past him. I stayed standing, the table between us, trying to keep my breathing steady. He didn't move. For a moment it felt like he might be waiting for me to speak, but when I didn't, he turned his head slightly, tilting it as though listening to something I couldn't hear. That's when I realized something was off about the flat itself. The quiet had thickened. The dull hum of the fridge, the faint creak of the old pipes, even the distant noise of cars passing on the street outside, all of it had stopped. The room felt like it had shrunk, like the walls were closing in just enough that I couldn't ignore it. He took a step forward. I backed away, my heel catching on the rug, and my knee hit the side of the coffee table. The glasses wobbled, one tipping onto its side and rolling to the edge before coming to a stop. I half expected him to say something, to reassure me, maybe to apologize, but he didn't. He just stood there, one hand resting on the back of the sofa, the other by his side. It occurred to me that I hadn't heard him breathe since he'd locked the door. I couldn't look at his face anymore. There was something about it, something that made my chest feel tight, like my body knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. Instead, I focused on the door behind him, the way the light from the hallway outside outlined its edges. I stepped sideways, inching closer to the table, closer to my bag. His head moved to follow me, just slightly, like a predator tracking prey. My fingers brushed the strap, but the bag tipped, spilling its contents onto the floor. His smile widened. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't even look away as he reached down, picked up the phone from where it had fallen near his foot, and turned it over in his hand. He didn't look at it. His eyes were on me, and then without a word he pressed the phone to his chest, his fingers tightening around it, and waited. It was supposed to be the perfect night, the kind of date you brag about to friends, easy conversation, a couple of laughs, no awkward silences. Alex had been charming, warm in a way that felt natural, and for a few hours I let myself believe in the possibility of something good. When he offered to drive me home, I hesitated, not because I was afraid, just cautious, I suppose. It felt like the kind of thing you're supposed to second-guess these days. But then he smiled, and something in me relaxed, so I agreed. The car was small but clean, the sort of car someone sensible would drive, no flashy upgrades, no weird clutter. the smell of pine from the air freshener mixed with the faint scent of his cologne. I settled into the passenger seat and fastened my belt, watching as he adjusted the mirrors as if he were trying to make me feel at ease. We pulled out onto the road, and for the first few minutes, everything was fine. The streetlights stretched out ahead of us, casting pools of orange over the pavement. I gave him directions, but he didn't respond much, just nodding occasionally, his hands steady on the wheel. It wasn't until we passed the turn-off for my street that I started to feel uneasy. I glanced at him, waiting for some explanation, maybe an apology for missing it, but he didn't look at me. His expression hadn't changed. His eyes stayed on the road, his mouth relaxed in that same faint smile. I shifted in my seat, leaning forward to look out of the window. The houses were further apart here, the trees closer to the curb. This wasn't the way to my flat. I cleared my throat and pointed it out, trying to keep my voice calm, but he didn't react. Instead, he reached down and pressed the button to lock the doors. The click of the lock startled me more than it should have. I tugged at the handle on my side, instinctively testing it, but it didn't budge. My breath caught in my throat as I looked back at him, his knuckles tightening just slightly on the wheel. The road ahead stretched into darkness, the lights thinning out the further we went. My pulse thudded in my ears as I tried to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. He was normal, completely normal. We'd just shared drinks, laughs. There'd been nothing to suggest anything was wrong. But now his silence felt like a wall between us, and every time I tried to speak, my voice came out thin and weak. I reached for my bag on the floor, fumbling for my phone, but before I could grab it, he glanced sideways at me. That smile was still there. I lashed out before I could think, my hands clawing for the wheel, trying to pull it towards me. The car swerved, tires skidding on the tarmac, and I barely registered the sound of his grunt as we veered off the road. The impact came hard and fast, metal crunching and glass shattering around us. Then everything went black. When I woke, the world was bright and cold, and I was in a bed that wasn't mine. The smell of disinfectant filled my nose, sharp and sterile, and I could hear the faint beeping of a machine nearby. My body ached all over, every movement sending dull throbs through my limbs. I tried to sit up, but a strap across my chest stopped me. A nurse appeared beside me, her face impassive but polite, as if this were all routine. She murmured something about me being in an accident, about needing rest. I tried to ask questions, but my mouth was dry, my words tumbling over each other. It wasn't until the police came in that the details began to surface. They stood at the end of the bed, their notepads in hand, their faces unreadable. One of them explained that I'd been found at the scene of the crash. Just me, no one else. I stared at them, confused. I tried to explain that Alex had been driving, that he'd locked the doors, that he'd taken the wrong road on purpose. They exchanged glances, the kind that felt heavy with meaning. Then they told me something that made my stomach twist. I had been in the driver's seat. I shook my head, trying to make them understand. That wasn't possible. I'd been the passenger. I was sure of it. I described Alex to them, his face, his clothes, the car he drove, but they didn't look convinced. There was no sign of another person at the scene, they said, no evidence of anyone else in the vehicle. It didn't make sense. How could they not have found him? He'd been right there. I remembered fighting him for control of the wheel, the smell of his cologne still clinging to my clothes. I told them to check the car again, to check the road, but they just looked at me like I was the one who didn't understand. One of them asked me if I'd been drinking, if maybe I'd blacked out or gotten confused. The suggestion made my chest tighten with frustration, but before I could protest, the nurse stepped in, shooing them away. She said I needed rest, that I could answer their questions later. I lay there after they left, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece it together. The memories felt sharp and clear in my head, the way Alex had smiled, the way his hand had reached for the locks, the way he hadn't said a single word the entire time. But the longer I thought about it, the harder it became to hold on to the details. The exact color of his jumper blurred in my mind. Had it been green or maybe brown? And his face, how could I remember his smile so vividly but not the shape of his nose, the cut of his jaw? The nurse came back to check on me later, her eyes soft but curious. I wanted to ask her if anyone else had seen him, if anyone had come looking for me after the crash, but I was too afraid of her answer. When I finally drifted off to sleep that night, the image of Alex's smile was the last thing in my mind. And somewhere deep down, I wondered if it had ever been there at all. It didn't start as a grand idea. I didn't plan anything at all. Not really. It was just a look, the way she had smiled when she thought I wasn't paying attention. That fleeting moment had nestled itself deep, and for the first time in years, something inside me woke up. She was kind, more than kind even. She was thoughtful, careful with her words. I could tell she didn't like awkward silences, so she filled them with questions, laughter that felt a little nervous. I liked that about her. It made her real, not one of those polished shells who hides behind filters and plastic smiles. Rachel. I couldn't stop saying her name in my head. Even as the date wound down and her polite smiles turned into something smaller, I couldn't let it go. I drove home, replaying every detail, convinced that I had been, well, enough. Not perfect, but enough. When the text came later that night, short and clipped, thanking me for the evening but saying she didn't think we were a match, it didn't feel real. I stared at it for a long time, rereading it, searching for something that wasn't there. I tried to picture her typing it, her fingers moving across her phone, and I imagined her face as she pressed send. I couldn't make it fit. She didn't mean it, I told myself. Maybe she felt pressured to say something, or maybe she was nervous. I decided not to reply right away, better to give her space. But space didn't feel right. I didn't mean to look her up online, it just happened. Her profile wasn't hard to find. Her posts were a careful blend of smiles and holiday snaps, books and coffee cups. A normal girl with a normal life. The way she held herself in photos told me everything I needed to know. Quiet, reserved, thoughtful. She didn't post about the date. No cryptic updates, no clever little digs that might have been about me. That was a good sign, wasn't it? She wasn't writing me off. It was when I found her workplace listed under her profile picture that something shifted. I didn't act on it straight away. I didn't want to seem desperate, or worse, creepy. But after 3 days of no contact, I felt compelled. That's the word for it. Compelled. The building wasn't far, and there was a coffee shop across the road where I could sit and watch without being noticed. I told myself it was innocent. I just wanted to see her, to remind myself that she was real, that she wasn't just this voice in my head saying no over and over again. She came out at lunchtime, and for a moment I felt something break loose inside me. She was there, in front of me, but she hadn't seen me. Her hair fell loose over her shoulders, and she looked tired, her steps a little quicker than I remembered. She walked down the street and turned into another cafe, not the one I was in. I followed, not inside, of course. I wasn't stupid. I just stood across the street, pretending to browse my phone while keeping her in the corner of my eye. She ordered something and sat down at a table by the window. She was alone, scrolling on her phone, and I wondered if she was looking at my profile the way I'd looked at hers. After a while, she left, and I trailed behind at a distance. She didn't go anywhere unexpected. Just back to work, her bag slung over her shoulder. It became a habit. Once or twice a week, I'd park near her office and watch her come and go. It wasn't enough to see her online anymore. I needed to feel that connection, to see her in the world where she belonged. The more I watched, the more I learned. Her routines were easy to map out. Mondays, she stayed late at work. Wednesdays, she took a yoga class at the studio 2 streets over. Fridays, she stopped by the supermarket on her way home. I started to feel like I knew her better than anyone else could. The night I followed her home for the first time, I didn't mean to. It was late, and she'd left work looking frustrated, her phone pressed to her ear. She walked with quick steps, her head down, and I stayed far enough back that she wouldn't notice. Her flat was on the 2nd floor of a narrow building. Nothing fancy, but it suited her. I sat in my car for a long time after she went inside, staring at the light in her window. When I went home, I couldn't stop thinking about her flat, the way the curtains didn't quite cover the edges of the glass, the way her silhouette passed back and forth before the lights went out. The next day I bought a new phone, a spare, one she wouldn't know about. It let me keep track of her without risking her seeing my number. By then I wasn't sleeping much. My mind was constantly buzzing with thoughts of her, how she smelled, how her voice rose slightly when she laughed. It felt inevitable what happened next. I waited until a night when she worked late. I watched her leave the office, her shoulders hunched against the cold, her breath misting in the air. When she was gone, I let myself into her building. The door wasn't hard to pick. Inside, her flat was smaller than I'd imagined, cluttered but comfortable. I moved through it carefully, touching little things, a photo frame, a scarf draped over the back of a chair. I wanted her to know I'd been there, but not in a way that would scare her. She'd understand eventually. I lit candles on the table and sprinkled rose petals around them. I set out 2 mugs and made tea the way she'd ordered it when we went out on our date. When she opened the door and saw me, she froze. Her face was pale, her lips parted in shock. I stepped forward, offering her a mug, and told her the truth as plainly as I could. We belonged together. Her scream pierced the air and the mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor. She bolted for the door, but I was faster. I don't know what happens next, but I know she'll come to understand. I was drawn to her the moment she walked into the bar. She moved with a kind of energy that pulled you in, even if you weren't looking for it. Her black dress hugged her frame just enough to make a statement, and her dark hair fell in a way that looked effortless but must have taken time. She didn't glance around like most people do when they're waiting for someone. Instead, she walked straight to the bar, ordered her drink, and perched herself on the stool like she belonged there. Confident, but not showy. She was exactly the kind of person I'd been searching for. I'd arrived early, of course. These things require preparation. I needed to blend in, to look natural while keeping an eye on her. The bar was dim, the kind of place that tries to balance class and comfort. It was loud enough that no one noticed anything they weren't supposed to, but quiet enough that you could carry on a conversation without shouting. Perfect. Her drink came, a vodka soda, light on the lime, and she took a sip while scrolling on her phone. I let her sit for a moment, gave her the space to feel safe. That's important, you see. They need to feel safe. When I approached her, it wasn't rushed or clumsy. I'd rehearsed this. Everything about me was carefully chosen to appeal to someone like her. Clean-shaven, tailored jacket, just the right mix of casual and sharp. A polite smile, nothing too eager. I offered her a drink, a gesture, really, a way of showing that I was paying attention, that I wanted her to feel cared for. She seemed surprised, but took it. That's how these things usually go. People want to believe you're genuine, even if there's a small voice in the back of their head telling them to be cautious. She sipped it, slowly. I watched her, careful not to be obvious about it. It only took a minute or two before I noticed the change. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the glass down, and she blinked a few times as if trying to clear her vision. She glanced towards the bar and her expression shifted. I followed her gaze and saw the drink she'd ordered still sitting there, untouched. Her body tensed and I could see her starting to piece it together, but it was already too late. The room was spinning for her now, the world narrowing into a tight tunnel. She swayed and I caught her arm. To anyone else, it must have looked like I was being chivalrous, steadying her after too many drinks. I told the bartender she wasn't feeling well and that I'd take her home. No one questioned it. Why would they? I looked the part, calm, composed, someone you could trust. She was barely conscious by the time we got outside. I held her up, guiding her to the car. Her head lolled against my shoulder and I couldn't help but smile. She was so peaceful like that, her breathing soft and steady. The drive to her flat was uneventful. I'd planned for this, of course. I knew where she lived, how to get in, where the cameras were positioned. I'd done my research. Inside, her flat was neat, almost minimalist. Didn't tell me much about her, apart from the fact that she liked things tidy. There were no personal touches, no photos, no clutter. It felt strange, empty even, but I didn't dwell on it. I carried her to the bedroom, laying her gently on the bed. She stirred slightly, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. I brushed her hair away from her face, tucking it behind her ear. It wasn't about hurting her. It never was. I just needed to be close to her, to feel connected. I stayed for hours, just sitting there and watching her breathe. The room grew darker as the night wore on, but I didn't move. I didn't want to leave her alone. When morning came, she stirred again, her eyes fluttering open. She looked confused, disoriented, as if she couldn't quite piece together where she was or how she'd gotten there. I leaned in and kissed her forehead, a gentle gesture to let her know I cared. Then I left, locking the door behind me. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Everything had gone exactly as planned. She wouldn't remember much, just fragments, blurry images that didn't make sense. And even if she did, who would believe her? She was mine now, whether she realized it or not. The night had gone so well that when she invited me back to hers, it felt natural. We'd clicked effortlessly over dinner, her quick wit and quiet charm drawing me in. By the time we arrived at her flat, I was buzzing with that unfamiliar mix of excitement and comfort that comes with the possibility of something new. Her flat was small, but tidy, with warm lighting and a faint scent of lavender in the air. It was cozy, though there was something about it that struck me as sparse. The walls were blank, the shelves empty, apart from a couple of books stacked haphazardly. The dining table stood neatly tucked against the wall, but it only had one chair. I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe she wasn't one for clutter, or maybe she'd just moved in. It wasn't like I was expecting her life story on display. Still, the lack of personality in the space gnawed at me a little. She poured us drinks and we settled into her small living room. The sofa was low and firm, not especially comfortable, but we sat close enough that it didn't matter. I tried to picture her life here, imagining her curled up with a book or eating breakfast alone at that solitary table. It felt strange that she lived here by herself. I was sure she'd mentioned a flatmate earlier. When I asked her about it, her response was hesitant. There was a pause just long enough to make me notice it before she answered. I could tell she wasn't giving me the whole story, but I didn't press. Everyone has their quirks, their little things they'd rather not share straight away. By the time we headed to her bedroom, I'd let it go. The room was much like the rest of the flat, clean, functional, devoid of personal touches. The bed was a simple frame with plain sheets, no photos or mementos on the bedside table. We fell asleep quickly, the warmth of the wine and the closeness between us making it easy to drift off. I don't know what woke me. Maybe it was the slight creak of the floorboards or the faint sensation of being watched. When I opened my eyes, the room was dark, except for the dim glow from the hallway. I turned my head towards the doorway and my breath caught. There was a man standing there. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. His silhouette was stark against the light, his shoulders squared, his arms hanging at his sides. He was tall, taller than me, and his posture was unnervingly still. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was this her flatmate, a burglar? My heart thumped in my chest, each beat loud and sharp in the silence. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but my throat felt tight. My voice caught somewhere between my mind and my mouth. The man didn't come closer. He just stood there, staring. His face was in shadow and I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel his eyes on me. The longer I looked at him, the more certain I became that he wasn't just watching, he was waiting. I turned to wake her, but she was already sitting up, her back rigid and her eyes wide. She didn't look at me. Her gaze was fixed on the man in the doorway. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me frozen in the bed, her sitting up, and the man standing in the doorway. The seconds stretched, each one feeling like it might snap and break into something worse. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he stepped back into the hall. The light shifted with his movement, and I caught the barest glimpse of his face. It was blank, expressionless, like a mask that had been left unfinished. I heard the soft creak of a door somewhere further down the hall, and then nothing. She lay back down, pulling the covers up to her chin, her face turned away from me. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, staring at the doorway, waiting for him to return. When morning came, the flat was quiet again, the hallway empty. She didn't say anything as we dressed, her movements quick and efficient, like someone going through the motions. I didn't ask, I didn't want to know. As I left, I glanced back at the flat, half expecting to see him standing in the window, staring down at me. There was nothing there, just the blank glass reflecting the morning light. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just been a guest in her flat. I'd been allowed in, briefly, to a space that didn't really belong to her, a space that didn't belong to anyone. The man's face stays with me, though it wasn't a face at all. I see it when I close my eyes, in that moment just before sleep takes hold. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I catch myself listening for the creak of floorboards in my own hallway. And the night had begun so promisingly that I couldn't help but replay every moment as I walked home, clutching my coat tightly against the chill. He had seemed kind, attentive, charming even, a well-practiced smile and an easy laugh. He knew how to make you feel like you were the only person in the room. I'd been drawn to him, maybe too quickly, but that's how it goes sometimes. We'd met at a cozy little bar tucked away on a quiet side street. It was the sort of place that felt intimate, even when it was crowded. The tables were small, the candles burned low, and the quiet clink of glasses and low hum of conversations formed a pleasant backdrop. The drinks flowed easily, as did the conversation. He asked all the right questions, made just the right amount of eye contact. It felt comfortable, maybe too comfortable now that I think about it. Then abruptly he'd received a text. His face changed. subtle but noticeable, and he'd apologized, claiming he had to leave for some urgent matter. The disappointment was sharp, but I masked it. Things happen, I'd reasoned. Life is unpredictable, after all. I sat at the table for a little while after he left, finishing my drink and going over the evening in my mind. It had been good, hadn't it? Maybe we'd arranged to meet again soon. That's what I told myself as I left the bar, stepping out into the cold. The evening felt unfinished, though, and I couldn't shake a strange tension that had started building as I walked home. It wasn't fear exactly, but a prickling sensation that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. Later, I couldn't sleep. I turned on the telly for a bit of background noise, but it didn't help. My thoughts kept circling back to him. There'd been something off about how quickly he'd left. And that text, was it really an emergency, or had I misread his expression? The question gnawed at me, and the flat felt too small to contain it. Before I knew it, I'd thrown on a jacket and decided to take a walk. Maybe the fresh air would help clear my mind. I wasn't planning to head back to the bar, but my feet seemed to take me there anyway. It wasn't late enough for it to be closed, and the soft glow of its sign drew me in. I wasn't sure what I'd expected to find, certainly not him, but there he was, seated at the very same table we'd shared. He wasn't alone. The woman with him was blonde, her laughter spilling out into the space as she leaned forward, hanging on to his every word. It was too easy to see myself in her posture, in the way she touched her hair when he smiled at her. I'd done the same thing just hours before. I ducked into the shadows, my heart racing. I couldn't look away. It wasn't the scene itself that froze me in place, it was the familiarity of it. He was performing, repeating the same routine, down to the faint tilt of his head when he spoke. Even the drink in front of her was the same as mine had been. Vodka soda, light on the lime. I told myself it was harmless, that this was just the nature of dating in the modern world. People meet, they connect, and sometimes they move on, but my stomach churned as I watched him. There was a precision to his movements that felt rehearsed, calculated. Then came the moment that made my skin crawl. His phone buzzed on the table. I watched as he glanced at the screen, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. He gestured towards it, feigning surprise or concern, and leaned in to speak softly to her. She nodded, disappointment flashing across her face, and he stood to leave. I stayed rooted to the spot, my breath coming in shallow bursts as I watched him walk away. The blonde woman remained at the table, sipping her drink and staring at her phone, her shoulders slumped slightly. I followed him. I don't know why I did it. It wasn't planned. I just couldn't stop myself. He walked quickly, his hands stuffed into his pockets, head down as though he had somewhere important to be. He turned down a side street, and I followed at a distance, my footsteps quiet against the pavement. The streetlights flickered above us, their glow casting long shapes that twisted and shifted with each step. He stopped outside a nondescript door, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. The door closed with a soft click, and I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the blank facade. I wanted to leave, to turn around and go back to my flat, where things made sense, but something kept me there, rooted to the spot. Eventually, I approached the door. It was plain, with no sign or markings to indicate what was behind it. The air felt colder here, and the street seemed too quiet, as though sound had been sucked away. I didn't knock, I didn't need to. The door creaked open a crack, and I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, its walls bare. I could hear faint voices, or maybe just one voice, drifting through the space. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. When I glanced back, the door was closed. The messages had been coming through steadily for weeks, building into something that felt like momentum. A shared joke here, a thoughtful reply there. It was easy, effortless. I had matched with her on a rainy Tuesday evening when I was bored and scrolling through Tinder like it was a reflex. Her name was Megan, 28, with dark hair that fell around her face in a way that made her smile seem warmer. She'd replied to my message almost immediately, and from that point we hadn't stopped talking. It was rare to feel that kind of connection, especially online, but Megan was different. She was sharp, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. It wasn't forced or stilted. It felt like something real was forming. I hadn't been this excited about someone in years. When we finally agreed to meet, I couldn't stop smiling. We planned to grab a drink at a pub near her place, something casual to ease into things. The plan was set, the date locked in for Friday night. Thursday evening, I couldn't resist sending her a quick message. Just something simple, letting her know I was looking forward to it. The message stayed on, delivered. I waited a few minutes, refreshing the app, expecting the usual, typing bubble to pop up, but it didn't. Maybe she was busy, I thought. People have lives. It was fine. Still, annoying feeling began to creep in, one I couldn't shake. I opened the app again and searched for her profile. It wasn't there. She was gone. I stared at my screen, blinking as if that would change anything. The app wasn't perfect. Profiles disappeared sometimes. Maybe she'd unmatched me by accident or deactivated her account. But why would she do that the night before we were meant to meet? I told myself not to spiral. It was probably nothing. But the next morning, I woke up to a pit in my stomach that hadn't been there before. I checked my phone again. Still no reply. Something pushed me to open the news, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was some instinct, a quiet voice in the back of my mind that needed reassurance. There, on the local news site, was a headline I'll never forget. Woman found dead in City Park. I didn't want to click on it, but my hand moved before my brain could catch up, and the article loaded on my screen. The details were sparse. A body discovered early that morning by a jogger. No visible signs of injury, the police asking for information. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. Megan, 28. I felt the air leave my lungs. It couldn't be her. Megan was meeting me tonight. She'd be sitting across from me in a pub, smiling and laughing, just like we'd imagined. But what if? I spent the rest of the day in a fog, pacing my flat, refreshing the news and checking my phone every few minutes. No updates, no messages. My chest felt tight and the hours dragged. By evening, I couldn't stand it anymore. I put on my coat and walked to the pub. Maybe she'd show up, and this would all turn out to be some bizarre coincidence. Maybe the news had been wrong. The pub was crowded, lively in the way places get on a Friday night. I scanned the room, my heart racing as I searched for her face. Nothing, just strangers, laughing and drinking, oblivious to the storm raging in my head. I sat down and ordered a pint, trying to steady my nerves. The noise around me felt distant, like it was coming from the other side of a wall. I kept glancing at the door, hoping to see her walk in. An hour passed. Then two. She didn't come. I walked home in a daze, my thoughts circling the same few questions. Was it her? Could it have been someone else? If it was Megan, then how? Why? Sleep didn't come easily that night. My flat felt too quiet, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every message we'd exchanged, searching for some clue I might have missed. The next morning, the news had an update. They'd identified the body. It was Megan. The article included a photo. It was her. My stomach churned as I stared at the screen. She'd been found just a mile from the pub where we were meant to meet. I wanted to scream, to do something, but I felt paralyzed. The Megan I'd been talking to, the woman I'd been getting to know, was gone. I scrolled through our messages, my hands shaking. The conversations felt surreal now, like they belonged to someone else. But there was one thing I couldn't shake. Her last message from 2 days ago. Can't wait to meet you. I couldn't explain why, but something about it felt wrong now. I read it over and over, dissecting every word. It was her, wasn't it? The police didn't release many details about her death. No suspects, no cause, just a plea for information. That night, I deleted the app, but sometimes I still feel her presence, like a faint pressure in the room when I'm alone. I've caught myself glancing at my phone, half expecting a message to pop up, even though I know it won't. And then there's the dream. It always starts the same way. Megan sitting across from me in the pub, smiling, her dark hair framing her face. She leans forward, her lips parting as if to speak, but she doesn't say anything. Instead, her smile falters and she looks past me, her eyes widening with something I can't describe. I turn to see what's caught her attention, but there's nothing there. When I look back, she's gone. The morning of the date, I woke up earlier than usual, excitement pulling me out of bed before my alarm. I'd been texting her for weeks, long conversations stretching late into the night until my eyes blurred. Alice. That was her name. Her profile had caught my attention in the usual way. Swiping through Tinder, her photo popped up among the rest. But it was the way she wrote, how she seemed genuinely interested in me, that hooked me. We'd planned to meet at an Italian restaurant in town, a place I'd mentioned in passing during one of our chats. She'd said she loved Italian food. I remember her exact phrasing, anything with garlic and I'm in trouble. I'd laughed alone in my flat, feeling like I'd stumbled into something rare. But as I was getting ready that morning, I opened the app to recheck the details, what time we'd agreed on, whether we were meeting there or if she wanted to walk together. Her profile was gone. It wasn't a swipe error or a lag in the app. It was gone entirely. No name, no picture, no match history. It felt strange, but not alarming. I thought maybe she'd deleted the app now that we were meeting up. A clean break from all the swiping nonsense. That made sense, didn't it? I sent her a quick text instead, trying to laugh it off. But hours passed and there was nothing. Not even a double tick to show it had been delivered. I kept checking my phone, refreshing out of habit, hoping for a sign, something that explained the silence. I thought about cancelling, but that felt rash. Maybe she was caught up at work or her phone was dead. People had lives outside their screens after all. The restaurant was small, tucked into a corner on the high street. Warm lighting spilled out through the windows, the kind of place that felt cozy, even before you stepped in. I arrived 10 minutes early, nervously, checking the time on my phone. Inside, the hostess greeted me with a polite smile, and I gave Alice's name, explaining the reservation. Her expression changed, just slightly, a flicker of something I couldn't place. She glanced down at her book and flipped through a couple of pages. When she looked back at me, there was a pause. She told me I was the third man that week to come in and ask for a reservation under that name. I remember standing there, the noise of the restaurant around me fading into something distant. She wasn't joking, though her tone tried to be light. My heart felt like it skipped, but I managed a polite nod, something to show I'd understood. I left before she could say anything else. The street outside felt colder than when I'd gone in. My coat was zipped, but I could feel the chill through it, biting at my arms. I checked my phone again, refreshing the messages I knew wouldn't load. Alice. I played back every conversation in my head as I walked, the sound of traffic around me muffled by my thoughts, her laugh in the texts, the way she'd asked so many questions about me, little things like my favorite bands and whether I preferred cats or dogs. It had felt genuine, but now the gaps were showing. Little moments I hadn't questioned at the time. She'd never talked about her work, only vaguely mentioned a lot of hours. She hadn't sent many photos, just the ones already on her profile. When I'd asked to call her once, she'd said she didn't like phones. I passed by a cafe and glanced at the reflection in the glass, half expecting to see her there behind me, smiling like this was all some strange prank. There was nothing. By the time I reached my flat, my thoughts were spinning in loops. It wasn't just the reservation, it was everything. Who were the other men? What had they talked about with her? Had their conversations felt as personal as mine? I couldn't let it go. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, pulling up the local news. I didn't even know what I was looking for. Anything that might connect, anything that might explain why someone would pretend to be her or why three of us had turned up at the same place. I didn't find her name. What I did find buried in a news site's archive was an article from months ago about a woman matching her description. She'd gone missing after arranging to meet someone online. No leads, no trace, just gone. I read the article again and again, trying to convince myself it couldn't be her. But the details gnawed at me. Her age, her description, it fit too closely. The photograph wasn't the one from her profile, but there was something in the eyes, something that made me feel cold all over. That night I sat awake in the dark, my phone face up on the table beside me. I stared at the blank screen, waiting for something that wouldn't come. My flat felt quieter than usual, like the air had been drained from the room. The next morning I deleted the app, but deleting it didn't erase her. Her messages are still burned into my memory, fragments of words floating to the surface at random. I dream about her sometimes too, standing in the restaurant, smiling from across the room, her face somehow blurred and distant. When I wake up, I check my phone, always, just in case. I met Lauren on a Tuesday night at a bar that looked like it was trying too hard. Exposed brick, dim lights, bartenders with tattoos they probably regretted. She walked in wearing a black dress and boots, her hair swept to one side like she'd spent 5 minutes on it. Tops, but it still worked. I was already there, pretending I wasn't nervous, clutching my pint like it was an anchor. The date didn't go the way I'd planned. I'd made her laugh a few times, but there were moments, long stretches, where her focus drifted. She glanced at her phone a couple of times, like she was checking the time or waiting for something better to happen. She smiled, though, when we parted ways. A polite smile. One you use when you want things to end without a scene. I messaged her the next day. I thought it went well, all things considered. I told her I'd like to see her again. It took hours for her reply to come through, and when it did, the words were stiff, detached. She said I was nice, but that she didn't feel a spark. A spark? That word sat in my chest like a stone. What does that even mean, really? It wasn't fair. She hadn't given me a real chance. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. I don't know why. Something in my head wouldn't let me sleep. I got dressed, left the flat, and wandered aimlessly for a while until I found myself standing outside a coffee shop. I'd never been there before, a little place, the sort of spot you'd walk past without noticing, and there she was, Lauren. She was standing in the queue, staring up at the menu like she didn't already know what she wanted. Her black dress was gone, swapped out for jeans and a jumper that clung to her frame. She looked softer, somehow less put together, but I liked her even more that way. I hadn't planned to walk inside. My feet just did it on their own. I stepped in line a few places behind her, heart pounding in my ears. She turned around, and for a second our eyes met. She frowned, her mouth opening slightly. I looked away, pretending to study the pastries in the display case. When she left, I stayed back. I didn't follow her, not then. I wasn't ready for her to think I'd done this on purpose, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was some kind of sign. The city is massive. What were the odds I'd find her again like that? The gym wasn't planned either. I swear it wasn't. A few days later, I decided to try a new place. My old one was too far from my flat, and I was sick of the same boring routine. I'd seen this place on the corner before, with its glass windows that made everyone inside look like they were on display. When I walked in, I spotted her immediately. She was on one of the treadmills, her headphones in, running like she was trying to escape something. My throat tightened. She didn't notice me this time. I kept my head down, avoided the equipment near hers, and tried to focus on my workout. But every so often I glanced her way. Her face was set, her jaw tight, and I wondered what she was thinking about. Was it me? Did she regret not giving me that second chance? I started going to the gym more after that, 3, sometimes 4 times a week. She was there often too, always sticking to the same corner, the same machines. I never approached her. I wanted to. I thought about it constantly, rehearsing what I might say. But the timing never felt right. The first time I drove past her flat, it wasn't intentional. I was walking back to my car after meeting a friend, and there she was, unlocking the door to her building. Her hair was damp, like she'd just showered, and she was holding a canvas bag full of groceries. I found myself driving by more often after that, just to see if she was home, just to remind myself where she lived. I didn't park outside at first, that would have been too obvious. Instead, I parked a block down and walked past, pretending to scroll through my phone. One night, though, I couldn't help myself. I parked directly across the street and sat there with the engine off, my hands gripping the wheel. Her flat was on the 2nd floor, and I could see her window lit up, curtains pulled back slightly. She moved through the room, sometimes sitting, sometimes standing. I imagined her routine, putting on music, cooking dinner, maybe pouring a glass of wine. I stayed there for hours until the light went out and the room was dark. After a while, she started noticing. I could see it in the way she carried herself, her shoulders tense, her steps quicker than usual. One morning, she glanced over her shoulder on the way to her car, her face pale and tight, but she didn't say anything. She didn't report it. She didn't tell me to stop, and that's how I knew she felt it too. The spark she claimed wasn't there. She could pretend all she wanted, but I knew the truth. Now I'm outside her building again, watching the window glow softly in the night. She doesn't know I'm here yet, but she will soon. It began with a photograph. I'd taken it one Sunday morning, when the sunlight streamed through the gaps in my curtains and turned everything golden. She'd been perched on the edge of my bed, one leg tucked beneath her, reading a paperback she'd found on my shelf. Her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulder, her face tilted slightly downward. She hadn't noticed me holding up my phone, hadn't protested when I snapped the picture. It was one of those candid moments that felt too perfect to pass up, and when I looked at it later, I was glad I'd taken it. 2 months. That's how long we'd been dating. 2 months of wine in the park, lazy dinners and late-night walks where she'd link her arm through mine. We weren't serious, not yet, but there was something about her that made me feel like maybe we could be. Her name was Emma. She worked in marketing, or so she said. She didn't talk much about her job, always brushing off the topic with a smile, but she had a laugh that could light up a room and a way of making even the most ordinary evening feel special. That Saturday night, my mates and I were gathered in the pub, a dimly lit place just off the high street, the kind of place that smelled faintly of spilled beer and fried food. I hadn't planned to talk about her, but after a pint or two, I pulled out my phone, Scrolling through my photos until I found the one of her on my bed, I held it out to them, grinning. "That's Emma," I said. The reaction wasn't what I expected. Josh, my best mate since uni, went pale so quickly I thought he might be sick. His hand jerked slightly, knocking his pint against the table, spilling a bit over the edge. His mouth opened, then closed again, like he couldn't quite find the words. Across the table, Liam and Chris exchanged looks. Not the playful kind, like they were about to tease me for showing off a girl I fancied. These looks were sharp, uneasy. Chris leaned closer, squinting at the screen, and then he sat back abruptly, shaking his head. Josh broke the silence. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but there was an edge to it I'd never heard before. He said Emma's name, then added something that made my stomach twist. "She's missing." I laughed reflexively because it sounded absurd. I told them they were wrong, that it couldn't be the same person. They had to be mistaken. But the look on Josh's face told me he wasn't joking. He fumbled for his own phone, pulling up a news article. The headline blurred in my vision, but the photo beneath it didn't. It was her, Emma. The same face, the same dark hair, even the same soft curve of her smile. The article said she'd been missing for 4 months. I left the pub shortly after that, claiming I didn't feel well. My mates didn't argue. They just sat there watching me leave, their faces pale and unreadable. The walk home felt longer than usual, the streets unfamiliar, even though I'd walked them 100 times. The whole time my mind raced, replaying every moment I'd spent with Emma. Every text, every date, every laugh. How could she be missing? When I got back to my flat, it was dark inside, the curtains still drawn. I tossed my keys on the counter and sat heavily on the sofa, staring at my phone. I didn't know what to do, who to call. I looked at the photo again, zooming in on her face, trying to find something, anything, that might explain it. But she looked the same as she always had, bright, alive, completely ordinary. I decided to call her. Her number went straight to voicemail. It wasn't unusual. She'd said before that her phone battery didn't hold a charge very well, but now that explanation didn't sit right with me. The next day I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe there were 2 women who looked alike. Maybe the photo in the article was old, from before she'd gone missing, and she just hadn't told me. It didn't make sense, but I clung to it anyway. When Emma came over that evening, nothing seemed different. She smiled when I opened the door, brushing past me with a kiss on the cheek. She kicked off her shoes and curled up on the sofa, asking if I had any wine. For a moment, I almost forgot about the article. She seemed so normal, so perfectly herself, that I felt stupid for even thinking there could be something wrong. But then I started noticing little things. The way her gaze lingered on me when she thought I wasn't looking. The way she seemed to avoid certain questions, laughing them off or changing the subject. And there were moments, fleeting but impossible to ignore, where her expression shifted. It was subtle, like a mask slipping for just a second. That night, after she'd fallen asleep beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind kept circling back to the article, to the photo of her beneath that headline. I decided to check her bag. It was sitting by the door, the same leather tote she always carried. My hands shook as I unzipped it, careful not to make a sound. Inside, I found her wallet, a pair of sunglasses, and a few crumpled receipts. Nothing unusual, but then I found something tucked into the inner pocket, a driver's license. The name on it wasn't Emma. The picture was her face, but the name was different. So was the address. I stared at it, my mind struggling to make sense of it. Who was she? Behind me, the floor creaked. I turned, expecting to see her standing there, but the room was empty. The sound came again, this time from the hall. I dropped the license back into her bag, zipping it up quickly. My heart was pounding as I stood, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But when I reached for the door, I stopped. Her shoes were gone. I turned back towards the flat, the silence pressing in around me. The bedroom door was ajar, the bed empty. I called out her name, my voice trembling. The sound of footsteps came from the other side of the flat, and then nothing.